Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us here today for the Nurture Nature webinar, Stopping the Invasion, Red-Head Sliders in Trinidad and Tobago. And our presenters today will be Mr. Saifudeen Muhammad and Dr. Ryan S. Mohammed. My name is Lauren Ali. I'm a co-manager at Nurture Nature. I will be doing the introductions, and we're also joined today by our other campaign co-manager, Neve Vaughn, and our campaign director, Mark Gibson. So let's start. What are red-head sliders and why do we care about them? Well, we're actually going to be hearing quite a lot about that, but very briefly and to start, red-head sliders are an invasive species of turtle that is now found all over the world and in Trinidad and Tobago. So how did that happen? Well, these animals are actually very common in the pet wildlife trade. And this is a problem because it actually raises quite a few animal welfare and ecosystem issues. So to learn something about this, Nurture Nature did some anonymous pet keeper interviews with people who have red-head sliders, and we actually found these interesting and rather disturbing quotes. So you see the first one here. They don't survive, and the ones that do survive, I would say 50% of them either get relinquished or released. So why would these turtles not survive? Well, you can see here, this is a photo of a basket of just a bunch of baby red-head slider turtles. And they're being produced en masse for the pet trade and being sold to people who think they're cute and might have good intentions, but aren't necessarily well equipped to actually care for a turtle, which is a wild, non-domesticated animal. And people buy them for their kids, and after a while, well, they may find their turtle has just mysteriously died and they don't know why. And it's often because the keepers just didn't know how to keep a turtle alive in the first place. And it's pretty sad. And the ones that do live, well, a lot of the time when the keepers come to the realization that they just don't have the capacity to look after this animal properly, they give it away. And they might give it to a zoo, they might give it to a rescue center, but there are only so many of those and they're often pretty full. So they get released into the wild. And that takes us to our second quote. It's destructive to the natural species and our natural species already struggling. So as you're going to find out in this webinar, red-head slider turtles are highly aggressive and they basically take over from native turtle species, and they also cause other ecosystem problems. So what's particularly interesting about red-head sliders in the wildlife trade is that the harms that they cause are known, but red-head sliders are legal in quite a number of places. Now, internationally, some places have banned them, but in others, they are still a really common feature of the pet trade, despite the fact that there is knowledge of the ecological implications, as well as the animal welfare ones. And the trade in red-head sliders is only one of many possibly harmful legal trades that there isn't really a lot of research about. Now, animals that tend to get well researched in the pet trade tend to be widely charismatic. Things like mammals, sometimes birds, but not necessarily as much with aquarium species like fish, reptiles, and amphibians. And the red-head slider is one of these. Here to tell us more are our presenters. First up, we have Saifudeen Muhammad, who, despite being just 15 years old, is an avid hooper and naturalist, a qualified wildlife rehabilitator, and he breeds and releases our local spotlight wood turtle. If he looks a little familiar to you, that might be because you may have seen him in a viral video that was going around Trinidad in 2019, where he safely and successfully relocated a snake from his high school compound. We also have presenting today Dr. Ryan S. Muhammad, and Ryan is an aquatic ecologist with an interest in aquatic alien invasive species, among others. And he's also a council member for National Trust of Trinidad and Tobago. And Ryan teaches the Biodiversity MSc at UWI, as well as the Development Practitioners Program at Regis University in Colorado. So with that, we are going to hand off from me to Saifudeen. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Saifudeen will begin sharing his.
Good evening, everyone.
Saifudeen, go for it.
I'm being heard clearly and everything, right?
Yes, we can hear
Right, nice. Now, behold, the red-headed slider. Now, the red-headed slider is a subspecies of pond slider, and it's probably the most popular pet turtle in the pet trade right now. I'm sure everybody has seen the original Ninja Turtles movie. Those turtles were actually modeled after red-headed sliders. Now, say one day you walk into a pet store, maybe to buy some dog food or some cat food, and you pass this tank of these cute little baby turtles, and you think to yourself, these would make a nice little pet to have on my desk or in my office. Maybe they might be a nice gift to give to my kids or my nieces or my nephews. Now, once you buy that turtle, usually people don't do their research before they buy these animals because they're so small and they're so cute, they just impulse buy them. When they bring them home, usually one of two things happens. The first of that being, you keep them for a few weeks, a few months, the turtle just randomly dies. Why did it die? You don't know, but maybe it's because you kept them in air condition. Maybe they got an airway infection. Maybe you didn't clean the enclosure and they got some kind of other digestive infection, skin infection, and so on. Now, the second thing that may happen is you manage to keep this turtle alive for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and you realize this turtle is getting massive. This turtle is growing faster than you thought it would and bigger than you thought it would. So you come to the conclusion you can't care for this turtle anymore. So you decide you're going to do what's best for it and release it, right? Well, once you release it, that turtle then goes on, I'll tell you, to commit mass genocide on our native species, and I don't use that term lightly. Right. So what is an invasive species? An invasive species is any foreign species in an environment that causes some kind of harm to the ecosystem. And red-headed sliders, guess what? They have made it to being on the list of the top 100 most invasive species in the world. There are thousands of invasive species in the world. So to make it to the top 100 list, that's a big deal. They are very destructive. Now, the native range is in Mississippi Valley, northern Illinois, and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. If you were to look at this map here, you would see the yellow area is the native range, and the red areas are all of the countries, not the regions, the countries that they have now been introduced and now have wild populations, right? And now, unfortunately, in the native range, which is this yellow area highlighted here, they are now threatened due to poachers for the pet trade, mostly, and also people in those areas cook them and make soup with them. So if you look at this, red-headed sliders can be found on 5 continents in the world, which is really just the exception of the polar regions. Now, what makes these red-headed sliders so invasive? Red-headed sliders are a highly adaptable species. They're very hardy, very resilient, and they can survive in a wide range of water quality. What that means is they can survive in very acidic water as well as very alkaline water, and they have even been found in partially salty water. Red-headed sliders are very bold and charismatic species. They are very easy to hand train. That also makes them very bold when approaching our native species. Red-headed sliders are voracious eaters. They will go after almost anything that moves. Even if you put your hand into the enclosure, they are going to chase your hand and bite you. And red-headed sliders are very adaptable for captive as well as wild breeding. So once males and females get into an ecosystem, they are going to reproduce. Right? Red-headed sliders are also very aggressive. They're very aggressive to our native turtles, and they often outcompete. Well, in most parts of the world, they outcompete the native turtles for food, basking space, and territory. Right. Why do they make bad pets? Well, when they are sold in pet stores, they are sold very small. They are sold as hatchlings, sometimes a few weeks or months out of the egg. And the pet stores usually don't inform you on how to take care of them. So when keepers buy them, they're usually unprepared for how fast they grow. They can grow up to 12 inches, which is the size of a dinner plate, the females that is, and they are ready to reproduce at only 5 years of age, which is nothing compared to their lifespan because they can live upwards of 60 years. Right now, red-headed sliders are they are very expensive to take care of. They need heaters, they need a UVB light, they need a very large tank, and to get these things in Trinidad, it usually comes up to being over $250 to get these supplies to take care of them. Right. Now, for public health concerns, salmonella is probably the most common disease spread by them, so that's the one we're speaking about now. Now, in the US, between March in 2017 and February in 2021, a total of 4 salmonella outbreaks took place in the US, and the scientists that were studying these outbreaks, trying to figure out what was the cause. They came to the conclusion that kids were getting these red-headed sliders as pets, and then little children like to put things in their mouth, so they put the baby turtles in their mouth and contracted salmonella from such. Right now, for parasites, a study was conducted in Japan where a total of 7 foreign parasites were recorded in the local turtles, and it was determined that at least 3 of them came from the red-headed slider trait. Now, what's so sad about this is the native turtles of Japan that have been living there for thousands of years have never seen in parasites like this. So when the red-headed sliders were released into the wild, these parasites were basically dropped on them like a bomb. And how are they supposed to adapt to that? It's almost impossible. Their bodies aren't properly equipped to deal with these parasites, and a lot of them ended up passing away. And when it concerns the ecosystem, we're going to go a bit more in depth, but to give you a general overview of the world. When released into an ecosystem, in most countries that they are released in, they outcompete their native turtles in those areas. For example, California and in Japan, and we are actually seeing that right here on our own island of Trinidad, where they are outcompeting our native species or our local freshwater species of turtles. And in most places where they are introduced, they would have no natural species, no natural predators, and and they are foreign, so of course predators in those areas are not used to seeing these turtles, so they don't go after them. Right. Now, in regards to animal welfare, red-headed sliders are generally very poorly kept until they are released into the wild, and that's because in the pet shops that people buy them from, the pet shops don't tell them how to take care of them. Of course, there's Google, but most people just don't think to Google how to take care of the turtles for whatever reason. And they have very specific care needs. They need to have a UVB light. They need to be replaced every 6 to 8 months. They need 100. Well, this is if you are trying to keep them inside your house. They need 120 gallons minimum at full grown. They need a heat light. They need a hot and a cold side in the enclosure. And a good formula to use when you're trying to figure out how much water your turtle needs. Measure the length of the shell in inches and then multiply that by 10. And that's how many gallons of water you need to keep them in. So if you have a 4-inch turtle, 40 gallons. If you have 11-inch turtle, 110 gallons, right? Right, now this picture here represents probably the most common disease that these turtles get. It's metabolic bone disease. This is when they don't get proper lighting. And this disease is incredibly painful for them. As you can see, the shell is almost completely inverted on the top. You can see lesions on the legs, and this turtle can no longer pull its legs and head into the shell because its body has outgrown its shell. Now, a few more diseases that I get is shell rot. We don't have a picture here, but shell rot is basically where the shell basically rots away and eventually it reaches the internal organs, and I don't need to spell out the rest. Now, abscesses, when you keep them in dirty water, they will develop these nasty abscesses on their skin, and it's incredibly painful, as you would imagine. Reddit, now we're going to be covering Reddit cider specifically on our island here of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, to my knowledge, this map is not life-size. It would be a problem if it were. Now, the history on this island. Right. So in the 1980s, red-tailed ciders were imported to Trinidad in very large numbers, in like hundreds in these vats, or maybe thousands at a time in large vats they would import them in. And there was some evidence of escapees and releases during that time. However, the import for them was stopped later in that decade. In the 1990s, some escapees were observed, but nobody cared about that, right? They're just turtles. What damage could they possibly do, right? So nobody really cared about them. They saw them and it doesn't really care about it. No, let's go over these slides. Right. So in the early 2000s, the trade resumed, and there were more accounts of escapes than ever before. And today, you can probably see that in almost any pet store. There's a tank of little baby turtles selling. Now, something really interesting about red-tailed ciders in particular, their value is inversely proportional. No, I mean, their price is inversely proportional to their size. That basically means the larger they get, their value decreases. If you look at this graph here, you can clearly see that. Right, and the reason for that is, look at this picture here. You can see these tubs with various sizes of turtles. And would you rather have this tiny little baby turtle as a pet or this large one? Right? You can clearly see the baby turtles will of course sell out quicker. Right. Now the local releases in Trinidad. Now only one official record was recorded in Tobago, which for that reason we didn't include it on this map. But if you look at this map here, the red crosses here were observed in 2010. You notice that there's only 2 observations from 2010, and another study was made in 2017, which is these white circles on the map. Right, so you can see how in less than a decade, the population of these turtles has exploded from being in this small restricted area here to spread across the whole island. Now, red-tailed sliders in the modern day, they now have a higher distribution than any of our native turtles. And if you were to total all of our native turtles and compare it to the total number of red-tailed sliders, it is estimated that red-tailed sliders now outnumber all of our native turtles. Right. So now I'm gonna tell you guys some stuff about our native turtles and how to tell the difference between them and the red-tailed sliders. Of course, red-tailed sliders, it's very easy. If you see here, they have a red streak on the side of their face. Probably the easiest way to tell the difference between them and our native turtles. They're the only ones that have that. Right. So starting with our scorpion mud turtle. Now, scorpion mud turtle is the only one of our native turtles that has a hinge at the bottom of the shell. This hinge at the base of the shell actually allows them to completely fold up into their shell and hide their front legs and their head. So the Latin word kinosternum, kino, kino means movement and sternum means breastplate. So put that together, kinosternum, movable breastplate, and all turtles in this genus have that same hinge. Now, the scorpion mud turtles, they have no skin on their legs and their colors can be highly variable. Their skin can be black, it can be yellow, and I have observed a specimen where the skin was actually light green, not because of algae or anything, but that was the natural color of the skin. But scorpion mud turtles, they have no red anywhere on their bodies, which would differentiate them from our painted wood turtles or spot-legged wood turtles. Yes, drink some water here. Right. So spot-legged or painted wood turtles, well, you can kind of see why that's the name, spot-legged, because they have spots all over their legs. And painted wood turtle, it kind of looks like if somebody was to go with a paintbrush and paint this intricate design on their head. It's really beautiful. That's why they are my personal favorite species of turtle. Now, as for the Mesoclamis gibber, the side neck turtle. These are the most uncommon, the most rare of all of our native turtles. They are almost never seen. If you ever get the opportunity to see one of these in the wild, consider yourself lucky because not many people ever get to see these. Now, the side neck turtle is the most aquatic of all of our turtles, and at all stages in their lifespan, they have a completely black shell. And the reason they call them side neck turtles is because their neck is so long, they are not able to completely retract it into their shell. So they actually have to fold their neck to the side. And if you look at this picture here, you would see these two little appendages under their chin. They are the only turtles in Trinidad that have those little appendages. These are actually a sensory organ. When they are at the bottom of a river, they actually use those to sense the shrimp and stuff that they eat, the shrimp and the crabs and the fish. They use that to sense that because the water is usually not clear. Right. Now, one of the main factors why red-headed sliders outcompete our native turtles is their reproduction. Red-headed sliders lay a lot more eggs than our native turtles, and I'll show you guys that now. Now the scorpion mud turtle usually only lays 3 eggs and at the surface of the soil, which already makes them vulnerable to predators coming and stealing the eggs. The rhinoclamies, the wood turtle, would lay 1 to 3 eggs, maybe twice a year, with a total of 6 eggs usually. And they usually don't bury the eggs. They would actually just lay it on the forest floor and throw some leaves or some detritus on top of the eggs and just walk away. So predators can get them very easily. It is estimated that only 20% of wood turtle eggs ever end up successfully hatching. Now, with the gibber turtle, very little is known about their reproduction, but in captivity, they have been recorded to lay 2 to 4 eggs in the dry season, and they lay about 10 centimeters under the surface of the soil. Now, red-headed sliders. This is where it gets crazy. Red-headed sliders are capable of laying 10 to 30 eggs in one clutch, and they are capable of laying 5 clutches of eggs a year in optimal conditions. So, red-headed sliders are capable of producing a total of 150 eggs in a year. You can see why that would be so detrimental. And they red-headed sliders, they also lay their eggs a lot deeper than our native turtles. They lay their eggs up to a foot down, which means they even have a higher hatch rate than our native turtles. Right. Now, red-headed sliders generally tend to outcompete our native turtles for food. So, and eggs take a lot of food, a lot of energy to be produced. So if red-headed sliders coming through and eating out all the food of our native turtles, where are our native turtles getting energy to produce eggs. Well, they're just not getting it. So some years, if the turtles don't get enough food, they may produce less eggs. They may produce unhealthy eggs or no eggs at all. So not only are the red-headed siders laying more eggs on them, they may actually be preventing them from laying any eggs at all. Right. Now, the effects of red-headed siders on our native ecosystems, not just on our turtles. Now, they have very voracious appetites. They are very aggressive. Red-headed siders will go after fish, frogs, frog eggs, tadpoles, snakes, lizards, small mammals. If a baby opossum was to go down to the water, red-headed sider would take advantage of that. They would take it. If baby birds, they would go after baby birds, ground nesting birds, and their eggs if they got the opportunity, such as ducks. Red-headed siders have been recorded to actually eat baby ducks, right? And if a baby bird was to fall out of a tree, the red-headed sider would go after that baby bird. They would take up on that opportunity because why? It's good food, right? Now, red-headed siders are capable of feeding on large amounts of freshwater snails. That's something I would like to stress on. Now, from my experience, there was actually a fish pond, man-made fish pond that carried about 4 or 5 handfuls of freshwater snails, adult freshwater snails, and dropped them into the pond to clean up some algae in the pond. I went back 15 minutes later, and what did I find? I found a crushed pile of snail shells with 2 very happy fat red-headed siders next to it chowing down. The red-headed siders were able to crush completely through the snail shell because they have very powerful jaws, and they ate those 2 adult red-headed siders consumed about 5 handfuls of freshwater snails. That is ridiculous, and it probably would have eaten more if it was available. Now, if red-headed siders were to ever get loose on Tobago, they would decimate Tobago's crustacean population because of their powerful jaws and the crushing through shell it eats. If you look at this picture here, this is a scorpion mud turtle. This is a painted wood turtle. This is a side neck turtle, and the one on top is a red-headed slider. And if you notice, all of our natives are actually hiding in the shell, where this red-headed slider is out, not shy at all, and just walking around. This picture here was actually taken in Trinidad, and this is in the Trinity area. When this pond was made, they were probably, well, when this pond was probably had some native turtles living in there, but when people came and they released the red-headed sliders, well, the red-headed sliders either killed the native turtles or forced them to leave. And now I'm gonna hand it over to Dr. Ryan, and he's gonna give some of his accounts on the aggression to our native turtles, and then he's gonna speak about what can we do to resolve this matter.
Okay, thank you, Saifudeen. All right, so one thing I'd like to mention is that the picture of the 4 species of turtles there, all 4 of them are roughly about the same size, okay? In fact, the heaviest one is the red-headed pond slider. But what is interesting is the youngest individual of that lot is the red-headed pond slider. These are 4 that I've been keeping as pets for probably greater portion in the last 15 years, with a request application for a permit still pending nonetheless, but we'll chat a little bit about that as well. So alluding to the issue with Tobago, so a few years ago, Mr. Zolani Frank found 1 red-headed pond slider. I would say it would have been either a large juvenile or a very small adult. It was about 10 centimeters, a female, on the beach at the river mouth in Speyside. Now, this is important because Speyside is in Northeast Tobago, which is part of the UNESCO Man and Biosphere Reserve, which means we now have a report of an invasive aquatic species in Biosphere Reserve, in UNESCO Man and Biosphere Reserve. Fortunately, there's been only 1 sighting since we've been monitoring these rivers. But nonetheless, it tells us that we need to pay attention to what we have in our pet trade right now, or else this could be an even bigger problem. And as Saifudeen mentioned, they will estimate the crustacean population in Tobago. Tobago has a high diversity and a high abundance of crustaceans, native crustaceans, and these turtles will decimate that population if they actually have a breeding population there. So how can we control these individuals? So again, back in 2019, there was a news report where a game warden confiscated and charged a man for possession of 5 red-eye pond sliders. Now, under the Conservation of Wildlife Act, one would need a permit to have red-eye pond sliders. As you could see in this photo, however, these are not red-eye pond sliders. In that one news report, they referred to the animals as gallops, they referred to the animals as tortoises, they referred to them as red-eye pond sliders, which in fact they were the painted wood turtle. So it means that, one, our population our human population doesn't know the difference between our native individuals and our invasive species. And two, it means that it sets a precedence where we now know anyone requiring or would like to house one of these animals, whether it's native or invasive, you would need a permit. So they don't fall within the category of domesticated animals, unfortunately. So you still need a permit, whether it's a gallop, mud turtle, scorpion mud turtle, or a red-eye pond slider, one would need a permit. Another issue that arises with this is that you can't actually walk into the wildlife section and apply for a permit to get a red-eye pond slider. It's usually something that happens retroactively. And this is where some of the conflicts lie. So how do we deal with this scenario? Well, in other countries, what they've done is they've all right stopped the trade in these animals. In most island states such as Australia, Malaysia, New Zealand, etc., they have banned the import and trade of them. In the EU and in Japan, other countries, they don't allow for the trade of them as pets anymore. So, but in Japan, you still have individuals that have them in the pet trade. Again, it's probably under the radar, but you definitely can't import them into those states. Other countries such as America, they've had hunting and culling episodes, but generally what has been probably the best approach is public education campaigns, like what Nature and Nurture is doing here. Nature and Nature, sorry, is doing here. Another thing you need to understand, and Saifudeen mentioned this, is that we need to understand and work together with the pet industry. The general public, they need to understand that these are not suitable animals. So when you go into a pet shop, whilst the animals might actually be there for sale, this is where consumers could actually drive market pressures. If consumers, they understand these animals are invasive, they understand. Saifudeen, switch to the next slide, please. Thanks. They understand that these animals get large, they understand the animal welfare issues we have to contend with. They shouldn't be buying them. And in which case the pet shops will no longer house them, they will no longer have them on the market. So we need to, we as responsible citizens of Trinidad and Tobago need to understand that, one, this is an unsuitable enclosure for a red-eye pond slider, but two, we need to understand the animal welfare issues that surround these. Again, in other countries, they've had hunting and culling episodes where they go out, they hunt them for food, they remove them from the wild. This might be a tricky scenario because if we in Trinidad, we were to go out and hunt them and remove them, one, we'll get into minor legal issue because technically they're protected. So even though they're invasive, they're still protected. So that's one issue. The other issue is that if you continually remove the individuals from the wild, yes, we'll be removing the larger ones because that's the ones we see. We'll remove the ones that are more brilliantly green because they're easier to see against certain contrast. But we're also going to miss the individuals that are well camouflaged, which means you would now be leaving a population of well camouflaged individuals to be the next breeding population. We could only hope that limited population now forms an inbreeding depression and they die out. But if we continually release new individuals into this population because we're not responsible pet owners, we will be continually adding to the genetic pool. So this is where it's a bit of a catch-22. We need to stop keeping them as pets. If we have them as a pet, realize this is a long-term relationship that your generations to come will have to take care of. We also need to understand the animal welfare issues that's around it, but definitely what we don't want is to release into the wild, okay? And this is why I would like to recommend eventually, I think in the Conservation of Wildlife Act, there needs to be a fourth schedule eventually when it's amended that addresses the issue of invasive species, which would allow animals to be culled from the wild, but not traded. Right now, our vermin species can be removed from the wild, but you could also keep them, you could trade them, etc. To treat with invasive species, the term invasive species isn't mentioned in the Wildlife Act, so we need to incorporate this in our new legislation. On the flip side, and this photo that Saifudeen has up right here, this was actually taken in Asia, where in Asia they consume them. All right, you could go to a shop, and we saw all the wet markets in Asia because of the COVID issue, where people buy animals live. This photo was taken in Asia, and they consume them. But then you have the converse of this practice happening, where again in Asia, the Buddhists, next slide, Saifudeen, the Buddhist people, to promote good karma, they decide they would like to purchase them and release them in the wild. And now one would think this is good. At least they're not going to be dying and they're not going to be housed in poor conditions, etc. Your problem arises when now you're releasing, for the sake of good karma, an invasive species. And one, that will be detrimental to the other organisms in the habitat, but two, if you consider the wildlife, the animal welfare issues, that map Saifudeen originally showed, you would realize that these turtles are not found in polar regions. So if you introduce these individuals to areas that are completely unsuitable for them, they're going to die. So while there's that quest for us to have peace of mind and well-being and good karma, what we just did is gave that turtle a death sentence. And a painful one at that, because they'll be dead in the wilderness. So as we come to a close soon, the other strategy we could do is, again, trapping and sterilization. The issue arises where we will never remove all the individuals unless we continually have a program where we continually extract from the wild. But then you extract from the wild and do what with it? Eventually, our rehabilitation centers would be overwhelmed with them. If you have a sterilization campaign with vets, etc., that is going to be expensive. So the major issue here is we need to have less individuals being introduced into the wild, so we don't have to find these expensive alternatives. So as we come to a close, what we know now is that in Trinidad, I would say the red-headed pond slider is one of the most invasive aquatic animals we have. It has a distribution that encompasses more than in 3 native species. In Tobago, thankfully, we've only had 1 sighting so far, and hopefully we won't have more individuals in the wild. Tobago actually has 2 native freshwater species, the Kinosternum and the Rhinoclemys, and in much more restricted distributions than in Trinidad. So I would hope that the red-headed slider doesn't proliferate in Tobago. But again, this is where we need to ensure our research influences the management strategies. And at the same time, we educate the public, just like what Nurturing Nature is doing here. We educate the public to promote a change in attitude. We need to understand all cute small animals don't deserve to be in an enclosure for our well-being. We have to consider animal well-being. We also need to understand ecosystem health, okay, and ecosystem well-being, all right? And this could only happen with a change in our attitude as humans and as good citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. All right, so with that, I think we'd like to welcome some questions now, and I'd like to thank the organizers of this event as well. All right, so now I'll pass it over to Lauren.
Hi, sorry. Lauren's internet is unfortunately dropped on her, so we'll just be just four of us will be manning the Q&A section. Lauren is with us in spirit on the Facebook Live through her phone. So I'm gonna pose a few questions in the Q&A section.
Mm-hmm.
The first question is, how did an invasive species become protected? I mean, Mark, do you want to take that one, or Ryan?
Yeah, I can toss out, and Ryan, you add in as needed. I think the basic thing is that the Conservation of Wildlife Act it dates back to 1958, and so they started off with concepts that were very much of the era, and it hasn't been updated since. So really, back in those days, they were regulating for species that are roughly stated game species, which would be what's on Schedule 2. Over time, it's kind of come to add to it certain species that might be caught but seem to be okay in captivity, or at least sold during parts of the year. But that's still second schedule animals or game species. The other schedule they're working with is third schedule vermin, which is rather from my perspective, Brian, I'd like to hear it, but it's rather an outmoded way of thinking, that it's, there might be species with crop concerns, or there might be species with public safety concerns, but declaring something outright vermin is strange, because it's not really a scientific term. And so that list nowadays includes with it certain species that many conservationists, I think, would like to see protected or have more research to it. But that's essentially it. You have game species, vermin species, and then everything else is protected just by definition of being a wild animal. So these are categories that, as Ryan points out, we can update, that there probably needs to be something a little bit more tailored for invasives, which isn't even mentioned in the law.
Yeah, so the term invasive isn't in the Conservation of Wildlife Act. And the Conservation of Wildlife Act basically addresses all animals in Trinidad and Tobago that is, first, not a fish, and two, not domesticated. The Fisheries Act addresses fish. Now, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. The Fisheries Act actually mentions turtles, but they were referring to the marine turtles. That's why the environmental sensitive species, you have certain marine turtles on that. But our freshwater testudines and terrestrial testudines, the Moroccoy and our native freshwater turtles, they fall under that broad spectrum of wildlife. And technically, all wildlife in Trinidad and Tobago is protected. Whatever animal you keep that you've extracted from the wild, technically you need a permit to house. Now, how did a foreign species get encompassed into this? Again, because the Wildlife Act doesn't address particular species, it isn't targeting certain species. If you don't fall into one category, you fall into another. You're not a fish, you're not a game species, you're not human, so therefore, yeah, you would now be wildlife. That is why that individual could have legally be charged for having the gallops, all right? And again, It was reported as red air sliders. It wasn't. So that's how it was. Red air sliders became protected by default.
Yes, interesting. They just were given a default protected status, essentially, for a quick summary of that. But we've got another question here from Darren Henry from DNRF in Tobago. Hi, nice to have you here. He's mentioned that there's a number of wildlife farmers in Tobago, and he's not sure if they have red air sliders. And if they do, what do you think the approach should be? So I can say Corbin Local Wildlife Park, one of our NGO coalition members, they have a enclosure that they monitor, obviously, daily, that have red air sliders in a pond within the enclosure. These are sliders that were relinquished to them, so persons who no longer wanted to own them. They did not receive these from the wild. And I do know that there are a few people that do own red air sliders in Tobago. I myself, as a child, owned one growing up in Tobago. I just got it in the pet shop. But a hawk took care of my red air slider, made a tasty treat for it. But yeah, so Ryan, what do you think about the keeping of red air sliders in Tobago, seeing as how the wildlife sightings are so minimal? Should it be more strictly monitored or protected?
Right. So I would say, one, if any of these wildlife farmers have red air sliders, they should firstly be registered. All species they have should be on a registry. Okay, and that's what, and because technically that is the law, right? All species you have, you need to have a permit for. So that's one. Two, I would put things in place to ensure there's no breeding and trade of red air sliders. So if the enclosure they have them in order for them to have a permit, they should ensure there's no ideal breeding habitat for them. Okay, you could have them so that they're still happy. They have their water to swim in. They have basking spots, but don't have a habitat that will allow nesting. Okay, the red air sliders I have, they have basking pads, but the pads there isn't any substrate where they could build a nest. If the female sliders I have do have a clutch of eggs, the other individuals predate it, they cannibalize it because there's no substrate for it. So we have to ensure that our wildlife farmers are not farming red air sliders, but keeping them, rehoming them so that they're not in the wild. And that's the difference. We want to encourage rehoming, so because we care about the wildlife, the well-being of the animal, but we don't want proliferation in the wild or trade, because then that becomes a bigger problem. The other thing is, all of these wildlife farmers or people that doing rehoming, there's a cost attached to that. They have to feed these animals. So if more individuals, more people in Tobago and in Trinidad and Tobago have these animals, and when they get fed up with them, they have to find a place to send them. How do we facilitate that? So I would say, one, ensure no breeding conditions are there, and that we have these farmers registered. And two, definitely don't encourage trade of them. Okay, and another thing, we should actually keep a better tab on what animals are traded between Trinidad and Tobago, because these animals, they didn't come from any other places other than Trinidad. There's that trade, and this is where that relationship between movement of animals between Trinidad and Tobago for purposes of trade and otherwise need a better sense of regulation as well. Okay.
That's interesting. Also, I might also suggest, in terms of our wildlife farmers or people that are rehoming or acting as sort of a relinquishing service, also to consider escapees. So you wouldn't want to have them in an enclosure or a pond that, say, if a flooding incident was to occur, they could escape and get into the natural ecosystem. So that's also something to consider, whether that's a fencing or something like that. An overflow pond that you monitor greatly as well. And also, when they're small, they're about the size of a crix when they're babies. So you wouldn't want them to just slip through an enclosure as well. Let's see what other questions we have. Also, if any of the participants, I'm keeping a look on the Facebook Live as well for questions. You can put your questions in the Q&A or even within the chat. I'll check them there. So we have someone who's asked, for those of us with these turtles as pets, are there any home remedies that can help with early signs of shell rot? And also, can a domestic turtle purchased from a pet store as a baby still get salmonella?
I think I can take that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in regards to the shell rot, what you want to do, you want to treat it immediately. Usually what I do with my turtles is I treat the shell with an iodine solution, put a few drops of that iodine solution on the affected area and let it dry on it. Also betadine can work if you don't have access to iodine. And with salmonella, it doesn't just magically appear. It needs to be contracted from somewhere. Maybe another animal may bring it into the enclosure or something like that. But maybe you may touch something affected with salmonella and then put your hand in the enclosure, and that's how that animal would contract it.
And the best remedy for that would be keeping your enclosure clean and washing
Yeah,
your
keep
hands.
your enclosure clean, no cross-contamination, nothing like that.
Yeah, washing your hands after
Yeah,
handling.
wash your hands before and after touching the animals.
We have a statement, kind of a question. Are pet shops checked on a regular basis to ensure that illegal animals are not sold, and are there any regulations for pet shops? It's a tricky one. Mark or Ryan, do you want to take that?
I could take a bit of it and then Mark could jump in as well. So I know pet shops are checked by the wildlife officers and the game wardens. There's an issue of human resource. That is one. The other issue is that it's a gray area with regards to which species are allowed to be traded and which species are not allowed. So I would say the shops are checked, but in terms of if red air sliders, if you get a pet shop would get charged for having them, I would say right now, no. It should be according to the Wildlife Act, but again, this is where I think the pet shop owners, they need to be sensitized as well to know that what they're doing is actually trading in an illegal animal.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's something to note in your studies, Ryan, of the observations made in the wild. Originally, you saw them in watersheds that would have been related to human settlements, as well as, the trade. So you have an increase in trade in more densely populated areas. You have increase in people keeping them. And so there's a direct correlation between their release and observation in the wild to pet shops and trade and people keeping them. So that's also something of note. Mark, do you want to kind of take a stab at that, or can?
Yeah, well, just to contribute to what Ryan has said here, I have spoken to some of the leadership with the game wardens, and yes, they are fully interpreting these as protected animals, but it's a situation where with manpower and rollout in the past that they got essentially, well, this is me putting my interpretation, but I would say you get into a little bit situation where you're stuck, because if you can't implement this ban on sales effectively, you're going to be causing so many more problems with red-eared sliders getting released, whether it be by owners who are suddenly fearful or pet shops who no longer have need. I mean, I've seen some of these breeding facilities. You're talking about thousands of red-eared sliders in captive situations. So there's not an easy solution, but it's certainly one to go out and start just enforcing against this and criminalizing the practice. It's really, like Ryan pointed out so well in his talk, you have to bring the community together and figure out the right solution here.
We do have someone, he thinks he might have missed it, but we can maybe just give a quick summary. How are we going to deal with the situation even after bringing about awareness? Are we to go and catch them in the wild and take them away? So Ryan, basically just summarize your last few slides.
Yeah,
there.
so I think if I had to see an immediate plan of action, One, we engage with the wildlife officers so that if we do our extraction process, it's a permitted extraction process. But that has to be a sustained extraction process continuously so that we remove individuals. And that is still the hope that in hope that removing a breeding population. But at the same time, we have to encourage people to not purchase them from pet shops again, or purchase them again, because if we have a market being generated via the pet shops will continue to sell. And this is where the public needs to know, don't buy red hair sliders. This is a market-driven problem, okay? So don't buy them, they're bad for you. How many people have a pet kobo? Pet kobo is great for the environment, but we don't want to have a pet kobo because, and you have no one selling pet kobos because the market doesn't want that, right? So the same thing. I mean, it's a different ecological niche, but still, right? Market driven, right? Don't buy them.
I have actually seen somebody with a pet kobo they want,
I know
and they
someone
stole
with a
the
pet
chick from the nest here.
Oh, no. Or, you know, the Nurture Nature campaign, while Ryan can never say our name right, despite being an advisor, he always says our name wrong. It's Nurture Nature, not Nurturing Nature, Ryan.
I know.
But we have one of our social marketing points is just simply don't buy wild. Hashtag don't buy wild. So, you know, stick to domestics, rescue a puppy or a cat from one of our numerous animal shelters. Stay away from the impulse purchase of a cute little turtle. Just because it's there and it's cute doesn't mean it's an appropriate pet. So we have a few more questions still. We've got about 15 minutes or so still of Q&A. If we still have questions rolling in, we'll keep going. So we have one person saying, are there any mass breeding programs in Trinidad to help promote the population of native turtle species where maybe citizens with the space to help can offer their land or get training or permit for that purpose? I don't believe there is a permit just available for breeding and releasing, but there are rehabilitation. El Socorro Wildlife Center do offer rehab courses. Ryan, do you have any suggestions for this? Or maybe Saifudeen, you personally?
I'll let Saifudeen take this one.
I personally work with the spot-legged wood turtle, but the thing is with our native turtles, I believe each one of them do need their own captive breeding programs, right? Because with the competition from the red-head sliders, who knows how long they're going to be there. We need insurance colonies in captivity to make sure we keep our unique blood on our turtles safe.
Right. The issue with captive breeding programs, though, is that if you breed for the purposes of releasing in the wild and all you're doing is feeding predators, then it's a lost cause. So we need to figure out why we have decreases in certain populations before we just release animals in the wild. We could just be feeding invasives. And the other thing is, if the conditions in the wild allow for these animals to survive, we could just be giving them a death sentence. So we need to look at the way we manage watersheds as well.
That is true. Yeah.
We
and
need
also
to
we
pay
need to
attention.
maintain the genetic diversity. If we do have captive breeding programs, we need to make sure brothers are not breeding with sisters and cousins are not breeding with each other, right? Because that is going to kill the immune system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to prevent inbreeding depressions.
Yes. Also one thing to note, just in terms of the trade, captive breeding programs can be very useful, but we do have to be mindful of supplying a trade, and we also have to be mindful of laundering of wild caught for sale animals and the like. So we do have to just be careful that the captive breeding programs don't actually supply a demand for the keeping of these native species. Because we still don't think that the native species are appropriate pets. They're wild animals, they're not domestic, they should be kept in the wild. So captive breeding programs are great as long as people aren't paying for and purchasing the captive bred species. We have someone saying in the Facebook Live, basically, what can the normal average citizen do to help? Firstly, don't buy wild. And then just, educate the person next to you, your neighbor, your cousin, your uncle, your aunt, that red-eared sliders are not appropriate pets and they are in fact invasive. Most people don't consider their invasiveness when they're purchasing them, as well as they don't consider their animal welfare and the requirements they need when purchasing. As Saifudeen has mentioned, they're sort of an impulse buy at a pet store. You go in to buy cat food and you leave with a baby turtle. So we need most easily public awareness, social marketing. You can share our posts on Facebook and any social media accounts. We're on Twitter, we're on social media, we have a website. You can share information on the red-eared slider. This webinar will be recorded and available for viewing later on. So you can, share this video straight to anyone you think may be considering buying and owning a red-eared slider. Let's see, do we have any other questions? We have Renoir from TTFNC. Hi. He has a question. Dr. Mohammed, are there any local research studies looking into how the red-eared slider outcompetes with the native turtle species in terms of its aggressive behavior towards basking, feeding, and refuge choice, etc.?
So I know there was some research done looking at them in the enclosures at the Emperor Valley Zoo. I know of at least 2 individuals that did research on those observations, and they saw, red-eared sliders, they just kind of toss everybody off the basking spots. They toss them off a log or they just bully them across. I have seen them in enclosures where red-eared sliders actually decapitated juvenile rhinoclamies, juvenile gallops. So they, apart from being bolder, they definitely show more signs of aggression. They're more diverse in the way they consume food. Rhinoclamies is omnivorous, but red-eared slider is a vicious omnivorous animal. Okay, so their aggression is for resources on the whole, basking resources, as well as habitats for reproduction and mechanisms to obtain food. If people that actually have them with fish, you need to have them with fast moving fish, maybe like koi's or something, or some sort of charasin, because even if you put them with fish, they would eat your fish.
Interesting. Of course, invasive species really should be one priority when it comes to research, just because we are an island country, and so our biodiversity is of utmost importance and at many risks simply by our island biogeography. So of course, research is always needed in terms of alien invasive species. Ryan has published 2 papers on the red-eared sliders through the TTFN's three with the TTFNC's Living World journal. So yeah, I think that's fantastic. We have one person in the Q&A saying that if they have a red-eared slider as a pet, can they take it to the zoo? Will they take it?
So in the past, the zoo, they have offered that type of rehome, and I wouldn't call it service facility. I don't know if that facility is available now. Again, there's a cost to housing these things. I think the best way to address this is for an individual to contact the zoo directly to see if they would be willing to take the animal. I don't think any of us here can really vouch for what the zoo will do in a situation like that. I know in the past, I remember when I was on undergrad on field trips to the zookeepers said, people in the past brought these animals to them, and they housed it and they even kept them in enclosures with agoutis, because they said the agoutis would dig up the eggs and eat the eggs. So at least they didn't have continuous breeding as well. But I don't know if the zoo would continue to do this.
Interesting about the agoutis in the same enclosure. We have one person saying, notwithstanding the call of the public to desist from purchasing these turtles as pet and hope for then the knock-on effect with that, and a result in behavior change, what is likely to happen with the existing supply of turtles at these pet shops if left unpurchased? So this is the concern that Ryan has brought up previously, where if we were to just immediately put in place a sale ban, and Mark mentioned it as well, you could potentially have just mass release of these unsold animals into the wild, which is not what we want. So you'd want a coordinated effort between breeders, pet shops, pet owners, and a rollout of a ban on sale. A sort of one strike implementation of a ban might not be ideal if we're trying to actually keep these animals out of the wild. So it would need to be a much coordinated effort.
Step one is definitely have a registry of all persons breeding them and put a stop to breeding them. If this should not be a viable livelihood option. Okay, so have a registry of all persons doing this. If you're doing this without a permit, there should be a fine attached to it. So that might be the first step. The second step is if you have a lot of individuals and now you're going to stop breeding them, okay, fine. You phase it out into the pet shop world, and after people purchase this last batch, that's it. Anything after that, you need to have your documentation in place. It could be a mechanism for the wildlife division to get some money from fines. Who knows? But
also, in terms of hobbyist breeders as well, people that may not be selling to pet shops, but breeding for their own pleasure and sharing within their own personal communities, they should also be registered too. There should be something in place where they are an invasive species. So whilst they may be a pet and hobbyists may want to keep them at larger numbers than just the average pet owner, they should also be registered and monitored. Because, as we've noted, releases and escapees are common, and you wouldn't want someone who had a pond in their backyard full of red air sliders in a flooding event. Now their hobbyist bred animals are now released into the wild. That would not be ideal at all. So is there any other, I'm going to just do a last roundup of questions. I'm just checking the chat here. We have one person, Saifudeen, you could probably answer this. What can happen if shell rot is left too long?
Well, if it's left too long, it can actually rot completely through the shell and hit the internal organs, which would kill them. What you want to do is try and intervene before that happens. Treat it. If you need to take it to a vet, they would give it some antibiotics to kind of slow down that infection. But yeah, the iodine works magic. You want to use the iodine solution that's dry on the shell, leave it dry for a few days, and that usually gets rid of it.
In terms of
Neve, I'll give a plug to one of our partners, Trinidad and Tobago Veterinary Association. And if people are following our webinar series, a past presenter, Dr. Kavita Sant in particular, there are vets that would specialize in these sorts of ailments. So home care is good, but absolutely get to see your professional.
Yes. Ryan, this might be interesting to you. We have a message on Instagram where someone said that they've been looking out for red air sliders in the wild for years. They've been aware that people own them and that they are invasive, and these never come across one in the wild himself, but was once told by a person that they released red air sliders in double figures in, of all places, the Matlot River. Have you noted that in your studies or not?
So that's interesting.
Well, this is anecdotal, but
yeah. So fortunately, I had two project students that did investigations in the Matlot River pre-COVID. Okay, so early 2019, late 2018, thereabout, and we haven't found any red air sliders in the Matlot River, thankfully. Okay, so it's either what the releases didn't survive, maybe the water was too cold, who knows, or something else predated them, or the releases never happened in the first place. Okay, or it could be that we just didn't find the individuals as yet. It could be any of these.
A question I just thought of is what would be the predator here? Caiman as small, and then when they're babies, maybe any other.
Juveniles will definitely be your caimans, your anacondas, your ocelots, your hawks,
Raccoons.
yeah, that's happening.
Yeah, raccoons would go after the big
Raccoons,
one,
yeah.
raccoons.
Raccoons. So those would be your predators. But again, all of these predators will most likely take juveniles. All right.
Breeding age
Before,
adults.
yeah, before these
Our
individuals
crab-eating raccoon will actually go
escape
after the
clusters.
adults.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then, of course, notably, all the top predators we've just mentioned are generally threatened by overhunting and habitat loss as well. So while they may be able to predate on the red-eared sliders, their habitats and their populations themselves are diminishing. Let's see, do we have any other questions? Are there any foreign diseases that came from red-eared sliders in our native turtles?
If there are any foreign diseases that came from red-eared sliders.
In our native turtles?
Yeah, so I haven't done any pathological work comparing the difference in any of the bacterial diseases. What I do know is that your red-eared sliders, when they do get some sort of pathogen, they bounce back from it relatively quick as well sometimes. So they seem to be a little bit more resistant to bad water quality or just, coming out of stressful situations. I had several people relinquish their red-eared sliders to mini-baths, and they came to me not in the best conditions, but they survived. So they seem to be tolerant to high intensity, bad water quality, like any good invasive species that could cope with stress. And I should also say most aquaculture species make good invasive species. Anything you could propagate in large numbers, high densities, make good invasives. So not surprised.
Saifudeen, we have someone asking you if you've been successful in breeding local turtles, and if so, what species? So I think you've mentioned that already, but
yes, I have been successful for the past few years in breeding our local spot-legged wood turtle. As a matter of fact, I have about 18 babies right now that's going to be released in a red-eared slider free habitat in Trinidad. Now, fun facts about the spot-legged wood turtles. In the US, individuals imported into the US, they found that those are one of the most difficult South American species of turtle that to get to reproduce. So they
as well.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And then we really don't know much about the side neck turtle at all.
Yeah, one study was done on the side neck turtle breeding, but that was in captivity, and it was a long time ago, a good few years ago.
Interesting. We have a nice comment in the chat. We've got someone saying that they had one of these turtles as a pet when I was a child in the 1980s. So that lines up with our history. They were brought in about the 80s, yeah. And just thought that he was cute, never knew they could cause such harm. He eventually passed away within 2 years or thereabouts. So maybe you weren't looking after him quite sufficiently, because they can live long. And this has been a very informative session. Thanks much to the presenters and organizers for putting this together. # keep up the good work. Thank you very much, Jason Charles in the chat. We appreciate it. Saifudeen's mom here, thanks so much for including him in this. It was a pleasure to watch you all together. Such a lovely cause and mission here. Keep the passion and may you be successful in all your efforts. Thank you very much, Saifudeen's mom.
Yes, thank you.
So
Neve, I might interject just this is an old theme as we've gone through our practice sessions, but I'd enjoy hearing Ryan and Saifudeen's thoughts. In what way is this an example of how we need to just better regulate the aquatics trade maybe, or broader wildlife trade? What is legal might also be harmful, right? Do do you see right now, for instance, other risks that we might be running here with other species that could be invasive?
Mark, sorry, I didn't get that bad internet connection. You could just summarize that question for us.
Yeah, would you, looking beyond this species, do you see other legal but potentially invasive species that are popular in the trade or should be looked at a little more carefully?
Yeah, and definitely. So right now in the Fisheries Act, you need a permit to import goldfish and koi. So that's clearly something that's outdated. The Fisheries Act is in the process of getting reworked. There would be a new fisheries management bill, which is supposed to be addressing issues like this. So it doesn't fall under only the Conservation of Wildlife Act, which also needs to get a fair amount of amendments made. Red-air sliders are one that I would say is one that should be regulated, not traded at all. We definitely need to strengthen the way we move animals between Trinidad and Tobago, okay? As I mentioned before, we have the UNESCO Marine Biosphere Reserve. We need to protect this reserve from invasives. This is very important. And the only way we could do that is if we make the effort to keep these animals out. So I think first thing, one of the other things that need to be done is the public needs to know what we shouldn't be trading in. Snakeheads, these aquarium enthusiasts that like all of these nice, big, exotic, giant fish, highly predatory fish. Some of these fish, if it's invasive in anywhere else in the world, between Tropica Cancer and Tropica Capricorn, it would be invasive here. That's simple rule of thumb. Okay, if it's a big predator in the Amazon, it will be a big predator here. If it's a big predator in the Cambodian Mekong or in Africa, it would be a predator here. Okay, so we need to understand this. So there needs to be better regulation in these species. And the difficult thing with this is you can't expect the legislation to list 10 species not allowed or 20 species not allowed, but then you encourage a black market trade. Every species, this is why we have the IUCN Red List. This is why we have CITES lists, etc. And we need to ensure that our trade permits work in tandem with these international trade laws. This is how we promote a healthy, educated population, by understanding this type of information.
Definitely. And I'd like to just point out that Ryan is Dr. Ryan Muhammad is a advisor to the campaign, and you may have seen we've been doing a Not Native series on our social media, and Ryan has been helping greatly with informing our aquatic species that we highlight there. So most recently we highlighted the 3-spot gourmet, and we also noted the yellow apple snail. These are both species that have now found in the wild, and they do not belong there, and they would have definitely come through the aquarium trade. So while the aquarium trade does get ignored a lot, it's something that we really do need to be much more mindful of, as Ryan has mentioned. So I think we're going to kind of wrap up on that. I don't want to keep everyone much longer. So I'm just going to close off with a message there from Renoir in the chat. He very nicely said, where did it go? There you go. Thanks, Neve, Lauren, Mark, Saifudeen, and Ryan for a fantastic webinar. Very informative and thrilling to listen to. Keep up the good work. I'm keen to hear more about these turtles and their management locally. So thank you, Renoir. We hope to be able to give you more information on their management, and everyone stay tuned for more. We hope to have more webinars, as well as on our social media. Feel free to follow. The webinar will be recorded, and will be up probably by tomorrow online. We'll have it on our website for viewing, as well as you can check out the Facebook Live recording as well. So feel free to share. We will post that, and you can share it to all your friends and family who you think can learn some about the red-air sliders. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a very good evening.
All right, thanks everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you to Lauren, who we lost early.
Yes.
We see you, Lauren. All right, thank you. Bye, everyone.